So welcome everybody. I'm Martin Cloake, the CEO here at Raven, and I'll be your host today. Thanks for joining our webinar, How Renaissance Built a Frontline-First Approach to Continuous Improvement. I spent a lot of my career in tech, but I was fortunate to spend the first 5 years of my career working in manufacturing, and actually spent more than a year in Lakewood, New Jersey, where Justin's from, and we'll make sure that this conversation doesn't focus on our love of Lakewood, New Jersey. So I'll kick things over to Justin to introduce yourself. Go for it, Justin.
Thanks a lot, Martin. Good morning, everybody. My name is Justin Brennan. I'm the Director of Operational Excellence here at Lakewood, as the slide says. I joined Renaissance Lakewood about 3 years ago. I'm an engineer by background. I spent time in process design, manufacturing, and also consulting. So as I joked with Martin before, please don't hold that against me, but it's where I learned a lot of the Lean Six Sigma type stuff as well. So it's been a good journey so far.
Yeah, and I think the background in consulting is interesting. We can dive into this later, but ultimately, to drive improvement, you need to be able to influence, to create change, as well as capture data, and we'll jump into that in a second. So for the first key theme today, we want to discuss democratizing data to drive frontline engagement. Now, manufacturers have never had this much data. Our challenge today is to capture meaningful data and ultimately make it easier for our teams on the front line, whether it be our operators or supervisors or plant management, make it easier for them to identify problems and solve them quickly. And this is something that we've always struggled with. Why is data democratization important? And even from a definition perspective, I'm thinking if we were having this conversation at your plant in New Jersey, I'm not sure if we would use the word data democratization to describe this to your team, but fundamentally, data is important, but is only valuable if people actually get it. And in some cases, what's often missed is making sure that folks on the shop floor understand why we are collecting the data, understand even the meaning of that data. So yeah, what is data democratization to you and your team, and why is it important?
Yeah, so from my perspective, the data democratization is just essentially, it's a simple concept in theory, which is using the data that we collect and sharing it with the people who create it and who live with it daily, so that they get a chance to speak to it, to understand it, and really engage with it, versus just kind of throw it into what I call the data black hole, which I've seen a lot of times in plants where operators give invaluable feedback and invaluable insight, and then it just sort of never gets back to them. They don't have that feedback loop where they actually get to hear about it after they put it all in there. So what we've been focusing on was the challenges that we've had with that. And I think a lot of it was really just for us around building trust, and really making sure that we were able to show our operating team that we care about their insights, we care about what they gave us, and kind of shared it with them as well, so that they got to be part of the process rather than just an input to it and feeling like they were completely left behind.
So I guess building trust here, because in some ways, do you have an example of a scenario where you were able to to build that trust early on? Because I think one thing that I know from my time in manufacturing is that there is a distrust of anything new, and I think it's human nature to resist change here. So I guess an example of a time when you were able to actually have that magical moment when somebody actually sort of finally saw that the data that they are putting into the system was being used in a way that made sense to them.
Yeah, we've had a couple different examples, I think, with Raven and prior to our implementation of it. But on the Raven side, I think when we actually brought the operators to a computer screen and showed them, the data they were collecting and what we were doing with it on a specific packaging line that we were trying to improve, asking them questions about it and explaining how our engineering team was going to use the data they gave us to address the most pressing issues that we saw from that. It sounds really, really simple, and it is in practice, which is just, we went back and through respect and through treating them like people, we kind of said, okay, here's the information you gave us. And they kind of lit up a little bit and said, oh, wow, not only did they come out and actually talk to us and have a regular conversation about it, but they're listening to what we're seeing and trying to understand the pain we go through daily in trying to do our jobs and have a little bit of predictability in how our day is going to go. So what we started seeing was they would pull me aside and start to show me things on the line that they were dealing with for years that they haven't really had a chance to get fixed, because they felt like they weren't being heard. So it's a constant, you constantly have to engage, and it's not just something you do one off and then have this kind of epiphany and everything works. But through constant engagement and regular discussion, I started to see people change their approach a little bit, and it was really, really insightful and helpful.
Well, so in some way, there's a difference between calculating performance and describing what's happened. And I think in some ways, organizations sometimes think it's the same thing. They think that calculating OEE is describing performance. And I think that's where often there's frustration from operators or anybody on the front lines when they see this sort of, global metric, whether, similar to like a QB rating that describes performance. And one of the kinds of moments that I've seen is there's a particular dynamic when operators and leadership together look at the timeline of a day. So one of the things with Raven and is that we capture a timeline of all the events that have happened in the day, whether it is producing, getting ready to produce, waiting, or dealing with something that's broken. And often what happens is that there's a disconnect between what management and engineering believes is happening and what the operators know is happening. And there's a particular type of thing which is that first moment where everybody's sitting together and they see what has actually happened in the day. They see, for example, that an operator has lost 45 minutes waiting for, a part to be fixed. And there's sort of a kind of the operators with this sort of grin on their face going like, I told you that this is the thing that was slowing me down. And leadership going like, oh, that's interesting. And there's that connection point where everybody suddenly realizes that they're all playing off of the same sheet music. And the thing that needs to be addressed is this thing. And there's that's the transition. And I believe, the concept of servant leadership, where for organizations that are truly, have truly embraced continuous improvement, thinking about how to align technology and behaviors so that everything is focused around reducing things that are stopping the front lines from producing. So I guess early on, is there a specific example of when you were able to get those kinds of moments? And I'd be interested to understand also how this fit in with your particular approach to continuous improvement as you began to try and institute these changes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a great example of that. So our continuous improvement platform, it's kind of a joint base of, obviously we talked about the people side of it, but we also need to be data driven. So we recently did a value add, non-value add assessment on one of our filling lines. And what we actually did was we pulled the Raven data up and we walked through it with the operators and said, look, we can see the start time, we can see the breaks, we can see all these things. It's not meant to be a mystery or anything, but what we want to understand is the why behind it. So by taking these start times and looking at the actual Raven timeline and working with our operating team, we were able to understand that we had variability when we started. And it sounds really simple. And, again, this is all going to sound very basic at the end of it, but having that conversation with them and asking them, why is it so hard to start up, or what are the issues you run into? And then doing the gamble walks and doing the observations and having that on the floor follow up with them, and then having the conversations afterwards as well. The data itself provided the platform for the discussion because it became less subjective in terms of we need to make more, we have to go faster and all that kind of stuff. And it was more about, okay, we see what your day looks like. This feels frustrating just to see this timeline and see the red, then the green, then the red, then the green, and off and on. And it yielded a lot of insights in those conversations. And what it helped us do was also not just take the operators and say, okay, we're going to fix all your problems, or the mechanics and say, hey, you guys need to do this faster. But we talked about what we can do to solve this in a team function, in a team fashion, and try to tear down some of those natural silos we have, right? Because when you think about a production line, oftentimes I used to have a mentor in my old consulting job he said the coat of arms in manufacturing is this, right? It's everybody else's fault but mine. And I think what we figured out was by getting everyone into a room and just having a data-driven discussion in an open fashion and a constructive fashion, we were able to figure out that it's really not any malintent. It's just a matter of communication and kind of building that teamwork and the expectation setting as well.
I think you highlight an interesting point here because you've described kind of the concept of the problem, and then there is performance, and performance is really a collection of your what went well plus what didn't go well, and that's your performance. And I think when the conversation centers around performance, this is when you kind of get the finger pointing. But I think for most, for many of us who've worked manufacturing and in other fields, once you clearly define that problem and throw that problem down on the table, this is the point where instinctively we all kind of think about what we can do to solve that problem. And I think that the power of clearly identifying a problem or the root cause of inefficiencies is very strong. And then it's human nature to solve problems once defined. And I think that's a key thing. And I actually know that your alma mater, I read an article recently from McKinsey kind of describing how, one of the key things that manufacturers are struggling with isn't implementing technology or implementing change. It's knowing where to start. So to be able to understand your organization holistically sufficiently to say, if I'm going to pick one spot to start, I'm going to start, in this area. And one of the things that often happens, and we see when we work with clients, is that there's often a misconception around what the biggest opportunity is. And if you spend your days looking at machine data, you often think that the root cause of losses is machine losses or something technological. And you highlighted a case here where your teams are struggling with shift change or with start of shift. And just imagine if you have, I guess, how many people do you have at the plant at the start of shift? Like how much time does it take and how many people are there?
I mean, overall, I think the best way I could put it would be is we were looking at a 7 a.m. start, and what we were seeing was variability of 15 to 20 to 30 minutes. So the target is to be in the room and start it up within a half an hour. And what we found was that expectation wasn't able to be supported by the structure we had in place. So we had to make some changes and kind of understand, going back to what you asked about before, how do we build trust? Acknowledging that we weren't setting them up for success sometimes. And that was a big part of just kind of owning it and building that partnership and treating it like a true partnership versus just a transactional relationship that we have with
them. Which is, it may look transactional in Excel or in software, but for those of us who spent time in manufacturing, it's about relationships. And I think the more that we can spend having these data-informed conversations with our folks on the shop floor, the easier it is to create that engagement. And then once we have that engagement, focus our activity and our energy on solving our most important problems here. But it kind of comes back to that, that fundamental principle where you start with people, you give them good process, and at the end, find the kinds of tools to support this. Doing things in that order works. Doing things in the opposite order does not work. And many organizations are struggling by focusing on tools first rather than people first. So I guess we have a couple more minutes on this topic before moving on here. But I guess any other insights about the challenges just to begin to collect data. I guess the transition prior to collaborating with Raven. My understanding here was that you're collecting data in a way that many manufacturers do, which is through a combination of manual systems and I guess whiteboards, right?
Yeah.
And ultimately Excel. Everything, all ships lead to, all roads lead to Excel, right?
I was going to say Excel is the new Rome nowadays, where all roads lead there, fortunately or unfortunately. So I think when I first started here, we didn't have an OpEx department. This was something that we were building up from the ground floor. So obviously, what we started out with was, what data do we need and what data do we have? So walking the lines and talking to the operators, we saw some rudimentary whiteboards and some data capture systems, but they often didn't reflect what was actually happening. The data wasn't being captured. There was no sort of historian, if you will. And essentially, at the end of the day, the operators felt like it was just sort of a nuisance task that they had to do, and it wasn't really providing any value. So quickly, we started to say, okay, at least on things like the shift report, how can we capture that data and how can we start to share it with people? And then from there, we sort of transitioned into the idea of, okay, the line-based the line side board and the pacing board and things like that. How can we get smarter about that? And one of the gentlemen here I work with had talked about, Raven. He had heard about this OE software that we had, or OE hardware and system, and he wanted to see if we could bring it in. And I said, okay, this is perfect. A great opportunity for us to start to measure how we're performing a little bit better, pilot it, and then start to share that data and build that culture of continuous improvement by having these conversations that are centered around data. So it's less of that performance talk about, did we make enough of this or did we make enough of that? And more about, okay, how did it run overall? And I think you hit on something previously, which is kind of one of my core tenets, which is, if you think about manufacturing, the plant itself is greater than the sum of its parts. So the data will tell part of the story, but it'll give you the symptoms, but not always the actual diagnosis of what the root cause of the problem is. So what we worked on with a lot of that was understanding how the different moving parts inside our company work together and what the data could tell us in conjunction with those conversations. And at the end of the day, going back to the challenge we faced, it was essentially engaging people and getting them to believe that this was going to be different. Because the other answer you hear a lot of times, and I'm sure you've run into this, is, we tried something like that before, we tried this exact thing before and it failed, so I'm not going to engage. And it was really just having that open and honest conversation to say, look, I know this may not feel like it's going to work, but let's try it and let's try something different and let's fail forward. Let's fail forward together. And if it doesn't work, it's all of us together, and we'll make it better and try again.
Absolutely, and this kind of leads well into our next topic here. But just to close off on that data piece, I think, coming from engineering, I think, my impression of what the story that data could tell, especially the story that you can collect from digital systems, was way more significant than what I realized it was once I hit the shop floor. And the data in these systems in Excel captures a tiny portion of what's actually happening. And at best, what this data can do is to help to create these data-informed interactions in the right spot. But ultimately, the kinds of things that we need to do to solve these problems are a lot more sophisticated and have need a lot more context than is available from these other systems. So effectively, like, what we're trying to do with technology is to stand our best problem solvers in front of our most important problems, at which point, it transitions from, looking at the data to looking at the problem. And I think that's the key thing to recognize here, that there is the truth is way beyond the kind of things that we can capture in data alone. Sort of, and you mentioned engagement, and I think this is a good transition to the next topic here. As we know, data alone does not drive improvement. Manufacturing today and for the foreseeable future is still fundamentally a people business. Data and insights can drive improvement, but if and only if people take action. So, question for you is, how do you get front lines to buy into your continuous improvement process and systems to actually become sufficiently engaged to want to take action?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think, one of the things I view it as is it's less about buy-in for me and more about ownership, right? So from that side, what we looked to do was we wanted to craft a solution with them. And what that meant was getting their voice and giving them a chance to kind of capture the information, but in a way that made sense for them. So, as we'll talk about it later on, but as we built out our downtime trees and our asset hierarchies and things like that, we asked the question of, what do you call this piece of equipment? What do you say when this happens? How does this, what does this mean to you if I say this, that, or the other? And the feedback we started to get was, yeah, I don't know what that means. I don't know what EM05 is on this piece of equipment, but I do know this process it does, and that's how I call it. So as we started to build these tags and we started to talk through these ideas, we tried to capture their voice. And that was a general theme that we wanted to carry through this entire initiative was, we're building a continuous improvement culture. We're building a problem solving mindset, explaining what the 5 whys are and understanding from a lean manufacturing to 8 wastes. And one of the core wastes, I think we've talked about this before, is, the people themselves. We don't ask the people and engage with them. So really it was about reducing waste of our people's talents and skills in conjunction with all the core manufacturing stuff that you just have to do to build a good and well-functioning site.
Yeah, and I think giving them a voice is a key thing here, and that leads well into our next poll, which we'll kick off now, and then so for the next poll, how do you get your front lines to buy into your continuous improvement systems and process? And I think the first thing, gave them a voice to identify problems and share improvement ideas. Second, educate on continuous improvement principles and the value of tracking the data. Third, collaboration during the planning process. And fourth, we don't have buy-in yet, which I think many organizations are in that state where it's a work in progress. And I think everything is a work in progress. But I think this key thing here is to give them a voice here. So we'll let the poll go here, and I'll close this down. And again, we can discuss the results when they pop up here. But one of the things, improving with data is not new. We've been doing this in manufacturing for a long, long time. And even some of the methods that people used decades ago are still being used today, and it's because they work. So the idea of collecting data, working with your teams, creating a whiteboard to capture performance it's a pretty engaging process. And one of the things that that process of using whiteboards in Excel does is it allows for operators to be on the journey the whole time. There's no point at which operators don't understand what's going on. They understand having a whiteboard, having the red marker and having the green marker and using it at this point. And I think what happens often is if you come at this from a tools and technology standpoint, you look at the end result of these initiatives. You see the whiteboard that's configured, and I know that you have a pretty awesome example of a whiteboard. And you think, that in order to provide the same value, you simply need to replace this manual system with a digital system. And what that fails to recognize is that there was a process that created engagement, that created engagement that was actually brought people along for the journey. Technology, it's easy to just turn on technology with a switch, but us humans don't work that way, and we need to work more slowly. And it's great to see here this, give them a voice, to identify problems, which is kind of the key thing here that we're trying to do. We're trying to elevate the operator in front of the machine, give them that voice to point at that problem, and give them that stick to poke you and the rest of the organization to work on the right stuff. So I'd be interested to sort of hear, for you to dive in deeper to some of those experiences, and specifically around this idea of giving operators a voice and have them truly believe that you're listening.
We can do that. I think actually, if it's okay, we can switch to that whiteboard picture now, because this provides the context for a lot of what we were dealing with there. So what you'll see in front of you is a whiteboard from a line that we were undergoing a PPQ on. And basically what that meant was we were qualifying the line at its final qualification as part of commercial run. So we had an abundance of data on here. And I had one of my employees going out to take some pictures while I was off shift and things like that. And what I noticed on here was a ridiculous amount of detail. And the pictures weren't doing it justice, because at the end of the day, they weren't going anywhere. We had the pictures, but we weren't using them. So I just kind of went out and started talking to the operators and asked the question. I said, does this feel as insane as it looks? I think there's a little bit of an old school mindset. The operators need to feel the pain of something for them to fully understand it. And I've come to realize that with technology becoming what it is, and it's becoming somewhat ubiquitous, that we can trust people to do the right thing if we hire the right people and give them the ownership and the freedom to do so. So when we had that conversation, I asked the question, okay, this looks insane. Does it actually feel as crazy as it looks to me on the outside? And the answer was yes. We don't know why we're doing this. We put all this data on here, we don't do anything with it, and then we do it again the next day. So it becomes kind of this Sisyphus thing where we're pushing this boulder up the hill, and then we wait for it to fall back down and do it again the next day. And they literally had to erase their own work to do this the next day. So all that said, essentially what we went out to do was say, okay, look, let's build out a defined structure. Let's build a proof of concept tool, if you will, in Excel. And we did that. And we built this tool, and we started capturing it in a very structured fashion, using a defined asset hierarchy with set downtime rules and all that kind of stuff. So what we put out there was a tablet that links to an Excel sheet, and then another Excel sheet that aggregates all this data. And then in conjunction with the engineering team, we built a once weekly review of downtime on the operating floor in the room. Took half an hour out of the production day to talk to our team about what they saw, what the data said, and then give them insight into some of the short-term and long-term projects. And one of the things that we found was this soon certain feedback, whether it was positive or negative, started to reinforce behaviors. And I was amazed to see that I was getting calls off shift about the thing, Excel's not working, or, I can't put this in, or how do I make this happen? Which I was more than happy to take, because at the end of the day, it's all about ownership and engagement. And we were seeing it in abundance at that point. So I think one of the things we found with this was, and we'll talk a little bit about this in the next section, but Excel is a high entropy solution, if you will. It naturally wants to decay. And the more people you get in there, the higher that rate of entropy generation becomes. So it just wants to fall apart on a regular basis. What we talked to them about was, okay, now the next step in this is we've taken away the total loss of the historical data. So how can we build this and do something more robust? Enter Raven. So we started showing them Raven on other packaging lines, because this team on this specific line is a different class of operator, different grade of operator. And we showed them the other ones, and they said, wow, this is fantastic. It's so robust and so easy to do. So we're in the process of implementing a line of a Raven on this particular line. And it's going to be a game changer in the sense of the visibility to production, but also the consistent capture of downtime, and doing it in a way that it really feels respectful to the operators. They feel like they're being heard. And they're also going to have immediate access to that data once we go live with that system, which is something I'm incredibly excited about, because they want to engage. And I think that's kind of what this has reinforced for me. And you get that little bit of confirmation bias, so bear with me on it. But we have the ability now for them to use technology in a productive, constructive way. And it's done in a respectful fashion, such that they feel like they're part of the solution, and not feeling like they're going back to that information black hole of just throwing stuff in there and watching it kind of get sucked up and torn apart. So from that perspective, I think if we looked at the ownership and the buy-in, that's been a perfect case study for us in terms of just how well they've they've latched onto it once they've been given a chance to have that ownership and have that voice in the process that we have. And like you said, Martin, it's not about the tool, it's about the building of the process and the engagement, and then finding the tool that supports that and becomes part of that natural process without having to shoehorn it or wedge it in. And I think that's kind of what we found here.
I think when I look at that whiteboard, I see kind of the care that was put into filling out those numbers and writing in that content, which sort of shows to me kind of like a high level of engagement. And I think you see that level of engagement with whiteboards early on. I think you highlighted that it's kind of there's a place for whiteboards, and same for Excel. There's a place for Excel at the start. And then what happens is that these kinds of systems are not designed to be sustained over time. And what happens, and I'm sure you saw this when you worked in consulting, you have this little burst of innovation, of collaboration, of engagement, and then the honeymoon period wears off. And then what's holding it together is a whiteboard or Excel, and then it just fizzles. And then this is the test for whiteboards, is to run your finger down and see if the ink comes off. And then what you often see, these dusty whiteboards where basically stuff wasn't updated. So I think the key thing is to sort of not discount the value of the kind of interactions and engagement that got to this point. And now there's a way to get to this point with technology, but the kind of a collaborative experience to establish trust is so key. And we don't want to remove that from the equation, because it's important. And if you go from Excel and whiteboards to a technology solution, we need to remember that people need to still be brought along for that journey, and we still need to have that co-creation phase here. So I think we're a little bit behind here. So I want to make sure that we keep on going here. So we have time for questions. So I'm interested to sort of go into some of the results you were able to drive from this initiative, which have been pretty impressive here, and maybe just to summarize what we've chatted about so far today. So the key thing to drive improvement with data, first, we need to make sure we're capturing meaningful data, and meaningful data comes from various sources, whether or not it's your machines, your planning software, but in many cases, the most critical information is that information from frontline operators, which not only enables us to get more meaningful data, but if we ask them those questions in a thoughtful way, it actually creates that engagement. So the second one is, to drive improvement, you need engagement. People need to care. People need to know, need to be aligned. So you need to create trust, need to create engagement. And finally, what you've been discussing again and again today is this concept of, driving improvement through collaboration and trust, which almost sits above, the tools you choose to use, whether or not it's technology or otherwise. And so I'd love to get, a sense of kind of some of the results you were able to drive, as well as, what does the future hold for you? Continuous improvement means continuous change, meaning that, what worked for you last week is not going to work long term. So what does the future hold for you and for the team at Renaissance?
Absolutely. Happy to jump into that. So I think, when we look at that line itself, I think that was the record-setting performance we've actually had on that has been pretty amazing. I think, it's been a direct result of that partnership with the operating team, the engineers, the mechanics, and everybody else that's been out there day in and day out. And the data itself just absolutely has provided a valuable level of insight into where we need to focus our efforts, because what often happens, and what I've seen is, as you follow the time series of the data that we've captured, the downtime or the bottleneck has shifted a little bit. And asking the questions using the data has been a pretty cool experience to say, okay, so I see it feels like the upstream portion is causing a little more issue now. And they'll say, you know what, you're right. It actually is. I'm seeing a lot of things here, and here. This is what it looks like. This is what we do. So again, that data lets us drive such a more meaningful discussion in that sense, but it's also allowed us to hit record-setting performance on some of our filling and packaging lines. And we're starting to really use that data to drive improve our maintenance practices, improve our preventive maintenance practices, and do some condition monitoring as well to understand where exactly we may have problems going forward. So if we see more of those minor stops, or if we see bigger buckets starting to develop in areas that they weren't before, we know we need to get a mechanic or get an engineer to look at that ASAP. The second part was what does the future look like? And I think it's incremental, right? I think I've talked about it before with you in some of the conversations, that technology is very rarely truly revolutionary and often evolutionary. So as we look at this process, what we want to do is maintain the platform we have, maintain the good things we've got, and have those honest conversations about what's falling short. So what that means is we need more training. We need to help our operators know more about problem solving and get past the 5 whys that, understand fish bones and understand issue trees and things like that, and giving them the chance to learn the things that they might not have used but have the capability to do. And that's something that we really want to focus on just to keep them going. As we look, into the future as well, what we want to do is figure out how we can take what we've learned from Raven and expand that across the rest of our site. So define structures, the platform for engagement, the tool to kind of provide the lever to build these conversations, and then really start to use the data in a more real-time constructive fashion as well, from both our internally and then with our clients as well. And I think that's something that has been an unusual shock for me, is how powerful that the production data is for clients as well. So when they come on site, we'll have them sit here in a room, and as we talk them through what we're doing for the day, we can bring up the Raven screen and actually say, look, this is your line running your product at this moment that correlates with the video you're watching. This is your being in the room, essentially, without having to gown up and go into a grade B space as we do a grade A fill for an aseptic, product or something like that. And it's just been, for me, it's been, I wouldn't say fully transformative, but it's definitely set the groundwork for what we can do in that sense. And I think the tools themselves will allow us to really grow in a way that we didn't think I think was possible 5 years ago.
I think you highlighted an interesting point, is, sort of earlier describing how, you had, I think you used the word Sisyphusian, but the idea that, we were basically burdening our front lines with this data burden that was, limiting their capability or their capacity to drive improvement. And I think you highlighted the opportunities now that have come up to provide additional training. So we have a massive amount of problem solving capability on the front lines that can be unlocked by removing these data burdens, and also empowering them and providing them skills to be even more effective at finding and solving problems. So I think from a, personally, why I'm most excited about that 8th waste and the ability to unlock the capacity and the potential of operators in the front lines by removing, helping direct organizations to work on their biggest problems, but also removing some of these data burdens that is this data burden that's slowing them down and frankly frustrating them. So it's exciting to hear that you sort of are on that path, and it'd be interesting to see how technology evolves, and how we continue to find ways to drive continuous improvement, which is by nature continuous. So I think we're almost back on track here, but prior to jumping to the Q&A, I just wanted to open up the last poll, which is not like the other polls. So if you're interested and you're listening in right now to have a demo of Raven software, click on this poll. We're not going to present the results. This is a tool that works for us internally. So more than happy to chat about sort of some of the experiences that we've had with many kinds of manufacturers that we serve today. As you can see here, I think many of us at Raven, have a manufacturing background and a deep love for what happens on the shop floor. And in some ways, just now, this kind of conversation, I feel like would even be more suitable if we had it in the cafeteria of a plant. I always feel like I always remember those conversations where, you have folks from the shop floor, folks from leadership, sitting around, talking about really what's happening in a way that's, understandable to everybody. So we've launched that last poll here. So now wanted to open things up to audiences, to Q&A. We have some existing questions, but as we sort of close things off here, feel free to post questions in the Q&A, and we can answer them as they come in. I have one question here. I think it's directed to Justin from a VP of Research and Analytics. What has been your biggest pleasant surprise throughout this journey that will help other sites adopt?
There's been a lot of pleasant surprises. I think it's a good question. I think the one that jumps out to me the most is we have a weekly call with the Raven team. It started with a lady named Laura, and then we moved on to work with Connor and Lorianne as well. And I think what's jumped out to me the most is they have a remarkable level of ownership as we've deployed the Raven software and kind of built out our plant using the Raven equipment. This means that they'll ask us questions about our production lines and tell us what they're seeing in the data. So when we hop on the call every Wednesday, we have one this afternoon I'm looking forward to, they're going to come with our weekly report of how we did in our filling areas and our packaging areas and ask us, our tagging compliance might be here. What do we want to do to get there? Do we need any support? But the biggest surprise overall has been, it's not just been a technology deployment there's been a consistent engagement, a consistent level of ownership, and when there's an issue, they're quick to jump on it. And it's just been overall very pleasant from that part of it. I feel like we truly have a partnership here, and it's less about the transaction, if you will, and more about building a future together, which has been really, really cool and helpful for me as well, because there's an engineer here named Grace that's really kind of been doing a lot of the heavy lifting, and her work with the Raven team has been seamless. And I can't say enough good things about that.
I appreciate to hear that. I think it's always nice to get that feedback. I think the one of the things that we've always done in building our company here is making sure to combine expertise in manufacturing, folks who have steel toe shoes that are scuffed up. And I think that's something, having spent several years working in manufacturing, there's a certain experience you get. And I think you mentioned it yourself, getting up early, working 6 days, and there's a certain experience and you get in working in manufacturing. And I think for many of us, it was a very positive experience. And I think our team is excited to be able to support, manufacturers, in the way that we can with sort of software. But no, it's great to hear. And in manufacturing, it's fun to work in manufacturing. And I don't think as many people recognize that it's an awesome place to get experience, both with latest technologies and with leadership. It's a great place. And I won't comment on Lakewood, New Jersey here, but I had had a great experience there. So next question here from an operations director: do you need to interface with the ERP? And I think I can take this one here. So one of the things, if you want to understand what's happening at a process, you need sufficient context about what's being produced. So often information from the ERP is needed to understand the target cycle time for a given product. So if you want to understand if you're running too quickly or too slowly, or even in some cases understand how much time is needed to set it up, that is information that's often needed from the ERP, but we don't need to connect live to the ERP. A lot of this information can be captured asynchronously to be able to make it so that you're able to operate the Raven system without a live connection to the ERP. And as things evolve, we can absolutely create more connections with these other systems, whether it be ERP or MES or other advanced technology solutions. The key thing, as it is with operators, you don't need to jump right to the end. You can do things in an incremental approach. But as things evolve, you want to make sure that you are grabbing and obtaining context from all areas possible. And I guess maybe, I don't know if you have any comments to that, Justin, as well, because I know you produce many different parts. What can you comment on kind of the connection between what you're doing on the shop floor and your ERP?
Yeah, absolutely. So the reason that Raven was such a viable and helpful solution for us was we actually did not want to integrate it with our ERP right off the bat. We wanted a layered solution that wouldn't impact the validated state of our software or equipment. So essentially, Raven provided the ability to do so without any additional integration on that side. But as Martin said, if we want to, we can in the future. So that gave us the speed of deployment to do the proof of concept and do the pilot, from which we've rapidly expanded. And I think every line that's coming on site now from a manufacturing perspective is expected to have a Raven system on it, which is a market change from 2 years ago.
And there's another question that just came in. So does Renaissance, and I almost said it in the French way coming from Quebec here, but does Renaissance have any plans to perform this type of evaluation on other portions of the business? If so, what's next?
Yes. I mean, that's the exciting part, right? What's next? So what we want to do on some of our next phases of work specifically is look at the things that are more of an OPE type thing and less of an OEE type thing. And what that means is looking at personnel or process effectiveness. So what we want to look at is, from a changeover side, can we use the Raven module to define the changeover recipe and start to basically tap when we're done a step and get better discrete information, first of all, about the adherence to our process steps, and then also the time with which it takes to get those done. So there's definitely plans to do that. And we also want to pull that in some of our upstream portions on maybe the compounding side, but the possibilities are relatively limitless. It's just a matter of prioritizing appropriately. And I think where we're focused right now is specifically on the changeover side of things to make sure that we can get sharper there.
Yeah, and that's one area I think similar to shift changes. It's one of these hidden losses where, again, if you spend all your time looking at machine data, you can over-index on those kinds of issues where there's often huge potential to improve changeover performance. And one of the exciting things, and it kind of goes back to our previous conversation, is that improving changeover performance is one of the areas that frontline operations, if given the capacity and training, they can contribute to significantly. Like, this is something that they live day to day. And it's exciting to work on initiatives where operators can contribute and drive significant improvement through things that don't necessarily involve buying new robots or new technology systems. And I think those low-hanging fruit that can where problems that can be solved with the teams and resources you have in place are always really exciting.
It always starts with a conversation. So as we're starting this process now in our aseptic areas and things like that, we're sitting down and we're just talking about the interfaces and kind of doing that SMED exercise and understanding where we start at, right? What's the current forest look like? So when we upgrade it a little bit, we have a better looking forest, but we remember which trees we changed and all that stuff as well. So there's a lot of underlying, again, interpersonal work that has to happen ahead of time, but we definitely will be expanding and doing so using the Raven system on that side.
Awesome. Well, I think we've reached the end of our time here, one minute over. So Justin, I want to thank you for agreeing to be part of this webinar. Great conversation, and a great continuation. From kind of our sessions before this. I want to thank all of you who've tuned in today. As mentioned before, we will send off by email a recording of this. Feel free to reach out to us, if you'd like to have a follow-up. And yeah, thanks everybody for joining, and thanks to Marisha and Lindsay for doing all the hard work to set this up. This was a great conversation, and yeah, I look forward to next time.